Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I know this is one of the last sessions of the day, but thank you for joining us. I'm Molly Ramsdell. I'm the director of the Washington, D.C. office of the National Conference of State Legislatures. For those of you unfamiliar with NCSL, it's the bipartisan organization that serves the state legislatures of our country. So I always like to tell people that I have 7,383 legislator bosses, as well as over 35,000 legislative staff bosses as well. So today I have the privilege to be joined by several county experts for a discussion on trends occurring across the country. From the far end of the table, first, Doug Hill is the executive director of the County Commissioners Association of Pennsylvania, and he has served in this capacity for 35 years. I asked NACo staff, they gave me kind of how many meetings everyone has attended, and they weren't able to tell me how many meetings you have attended. So I don't know if you have an idea or just a lot. Just a lot. Okay, great. Next, we have Eric Johnson, is the executive director of the Washington State Association of Counties. Mr. Johnson was previously a county elected official. And according to the records I was given, this is his 34th NACo meeting, and that's only counting the major NACo conferences. That's a lot of meetings, too. And we're also joined by Julie Ring, the executive director of the Association of Minnesota Counties. Prior to that role, Ms. Ring developed a deep background in local public health work, serving at the Minnesota Department of Health and as the director of the Local Public Health Association of Montana, and this is her 13th major NACo conference. So welcome to the three panelists. I was excited to see about the diversity in the panel here when it comes to the state legislative side, because I think it really brings some unique perspectives. Minnesota is currently the only divided state legislature. Republicans hold, I believe, just one seat in. Are they one seat? All right, two-seat advantage in the Senate. The Democrats control the House, and the governor is a Democrat. In Washington State, Democrats control both chambers and the governor's mansion. And then in Pennsylvania, we have a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. So a nice mix of from the legislative side. The topics we're going to discuss today, we tried to narrow it down a little bit, and we're going to talk about disaster response and recovery, and of course also just in light of the recent events, in Alabama, and our thoughts and prayers are with all those individuals impacted by the tornadoes there. We're going to talk about marijuana regulation, elections, and taxes, and in particular, the $10,000 cap on the state and local tax deduction that was enacted as part of the 2017 tax reform. What we're going to do is I'm going to provide a little background on each of these issues, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to respond how their counties and states are responding to these issues. So you don't have to listen to us talk for an hour. What we'll do is at the end of each segment, we'll open it up for questions. So there'll be a couple opportunities for you to engage with our panelists. So with that, I'm going to jump into our first topic, which is disaster response and recovery. And here are just some facts. In 2017, nearly a quarter of all counties experienced a presidentially declared disaster: hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, and wildfires. Over the past 10 years, I believe Washington and Pennsylvania had somewhere in the range of 6 to 10, Minnesota between maybe 11 and 15. More than 25 million Americans are affected by natural disasters, and in 2017 was one of the most expensive years on record, with $306.2 billion in damages, according to NOAA, and obviously hundreds of deaths. As the rate and size of disasters is increasing, states and counties are doing more to mitigate against disasters. I know at least 19 states have pre-disaster mitigation policies, which include strong building codes, research on disaster, and intergovernmental agency collaboration. And according to a recent published study by the National Institute of Building Sciences, every dollar spent on mitigation saves $6 on future disaster losses. So to the panelists, and I can start on this end if you'd like. Sure. What's going on in your state and your communities to address this issue? I understand both resources and manpower can be challenging. Sure. So shall we share? We are going to share.
So thank you. So in Minnesota, we have something that maybe a number of states have, but was unique to us at the time. About 5 years ago, our legislature created a disaster aid contingency fund, which was important in Minnesota because the primary driver for this in Minnesota was if we had a disaster, particularly a presidentially declared disaster, in order to provide state matching funds to draw down federal funds, we had to have a special session of our legislature convene to allocate the state match so that we could access the federal funds. And that's complicated just on the surface of pulling the legislature together outside of normal session, but it's also politically complicated too because special sessions tend to bring about lots more conversation than the one item they're convened for, right? So 5 years ago, we had a bipartisan state and county joint effort really driven by our county emergency managers to create this fund. It was initially funded by only $3.5 million, which was essentially what they had on the bottom line to create the fund in the first year. And now it's up to a $10 million fund. And the idea is authority is there if there's a presidential disaster to pull the state match from that so that the resources can get on the ground as quickly as possible. But it also opened up a couple of new avenues for our local communities to access this fund for disasters that don't reach that threshold of presidential disaster. So it enhanced the state and county partnership to bring some state dollars in, even when the federal dollars weren't coming. You shared a couple of recent statistics of 11 to 15 disasters. Since the fund was created, we've had 32 disasters in about 5 years in Minnesota, and we've used $25 million out of this fund. So it's replenished every session after it's used. And those funds have gone to 72 of our 87 counties. So it's a huge issue for us. In Minnesota, maybe you can imagine this, our primary disasters in Minnesota are tornadoes, floods, and fires. And so particularly for some of them are, what we think of as slower moving disasters, floods, slower moving, there's a little more anticipation, but obviously tornadoes and occasionally fires are quick and immediately devastating. And we've had a couple of those, unfortunately, like we just heard about this week, that really devastated entire communities. And so to have access to that state dollar almost on day one was really important for our smaller counties in particular.
Great. So in Washington State, is this on? In Washington State, I think what's interesting is I was just scanning the types of disasters we have had going back a number of years from Mount St. Helens erupting. We still have active volcanoes in the Cascade in 1980, catastrophic disaster in there. We've not had a tsunami. We constantly plan for that coastal system. Earthquakes, clearly, our most recent large one was I think in 2001, the Nisqually, 6.8, $2 billion in cost. Landslides, we had a catastrophic landslide in Snohomish County, the Oso landslide that took out 49 homes and killed 43 people. We're not Tornado Alley, but we had a tornado in Kitsap County this year, which took out about 50 homes, really unusual for us. So we're hoping that your Midwest weather is not moving west. But catastrophic forest fires is probably our most significant one, and that is one that I think I would spend just a little bit of time thinking about. And I wouldn't say it's legislatively driven, but I think the state is working much more closely with locals and the federal government in understanding this vertical hazard mitigation and the types of pre-planning that we need to do to not prevent, because we are not going to prevent forest fires, but we can stop the intensity of the catastrophic nature of forest fires and the way that we both prepare and plan for in advance. The other thing that we, I think, have done, I'll talk just a little bit more about that, but we have a planning process that requires a comprehensive planning process and requires us to look at critical areas. And many of the things we're talking about, particularly around flooding, is how do we no longer build in channel migration zones or in frequently flooded areas, which might have been the historic area where we built. That's where commerce occurred. Was it the mouth of rivers? Guess what? That's where it floods too. And so how do we start thinking about where do we build and how do we build in a more resilient way, but also how do we plan land use around these critical areas, and we avoid planning and building in some of these, or building in some of these critical areas. But the frequency of fires, I want to just go back a couple of interesting statistics around the frequency of fires, which is really pretty stunning. We have had 78 days of a longer fire season since 1970 to 2015. So think about that. Our fire season is almost a full 2 months longer than it has just in 45 years. And I'm not going to say why that is, but it is a fact of what the data is showing us. The intensity of our fires have grown, and the cost has grown. We went from in 2003 at $16.3 million to 2018 and $112 million in state funding. And the 2015 fire, which was one of the catastrophic ones up in the Chelan County area, and where one of our commissioners is here, the U.S., between the federal government and the state government, we spent $348 million in fire suppression efforts. So the question really is, there's better ways to spend our resources. And so how do we start getting ahead of the coordination, collaboration? One of the things that the state has done a really good job on is really a risk assessment, is where are these fires going to be more likely to occur? And then how do we deploy and plan using the federal government resources, state government resources, rural fire district resources, tribal resources, nonprofit resources, contractual resources, and how do we appropriately cache and deploy our fire folks in a pre-planning area to where that is most likely to occur, based on research, based on analysis, based on forest health conditions where we think it could occur, weather patterns, etc., so that we are much better planned to stop those before they get to become catastrophic. And I think that's one of the areas where I think we've seen, not necessarily at the legislative level, but the implementation level most recently. And then I would just say outreach and communication. And this is a hard one, because one of the things that you have to be thinking about in terms of catastrophic fires is the forest health condition. And that means it needs to occur some sort of management activities that puts in place this combative relationship sometimes between the environmental community that doesn't want to do anything and those in the community that do think we need forest health treatments. And so pre-planning brings on a whole other element of the politics as well. So it's just not logical to some, is illogical to others. And so we're bound by this interesting element of what's happening with the catastrophic fire system. So I'll let Doug talk.
Thank you. Well, Pennsylvania is a wet state. We have thousands and thousands of miles of creeks and streams, rivers, and so on. So we've had a very long-term relationship with the EPA and the Corps of Engineers, among others. And candidly, we've been settled since 1682 when William Penn got off the boat. And so most of our development for the first couple centuries was along all those waterways. And so we have significant investments in property that is in streams and floodplain areas and has stormwater problems. We did take our first shot at mitigation back in 1978. We passed laws in the wake, literally, of Hurricane Agnes in 1972 and Eloise in 1976. And Pennsylvania also has 2,600 municipalities. Divide that by 12 million population. Average population is about 4,700 people, so our municipalities don't have the capacity. And so instead the counties have planning roles for both stormwater and for floodplain. But the way those laws are structured, and yes, I was there when they were written, the way those laws are structured was really more prospective so for new development or redevelopment. And so we've only recently been getting truly into mitigation. How do we deal with a stormwater problem that's been existing for a while? We have a comparable issue, kind of a chicken and the egg thing among some state agencies. So you have a storm event and you have a backup of debris behind the piers in a river, and then on the other side of that coin you have a limitation from our state agencies on how you clean that up, because how are you going to further degrade the stream down the river? So that creates an added problem of potential flooding behind that bridge. So we have all of those kinds of issues that we're trying to deal with. We are doing some things In a little bit more of a macro sense, we are now working on a full rewrite of our emergency services code, and that is going to fine-tune relationships state, county, and municipal. Counties are the ones as in most states, have the primary responsibility for all hazards planning, and then we work with our municipalities on the prevention, mitigation, disaster response, and so on. One other new area of exposure that we have, or I guess regenerated is better. Pennsylvania was the first state with oil wells back in the mid-1800s. Pretty well depleted the shallow wells by the early 1900s, but we are now at the forefront of shale gas and fracking and so on. And so that has completely reinvigorated that industry, and part of that reinvigoration is how do you get the product to market. And so in our northern tier, in the western part of the state where most of the production is, we have an issue with putting in all the gathering lines, and then because we have so much excess now, how do you get it to other states and how do you get it to foreign markets? And that means major new transmission lines. And what we're finding is two new exposures there that we have to deal with. One is during the construction, we're seeing increased frequency of sinkholes and subsidence and so on, so we have to deal with that. And then we have had a couple explosions, a little bit less than you would expect from the fracking and the wells themselves, a little bit more as we work our way through some of the aging transmission lines and reinvigorate their use. And so those are the primary areas that we're looking at. The other thing that I'll mention on the way by on emergency management, we did rewrite our 911 laws a couple years ago. We did a wonderful job with that. We congratulate our legislature, remarkably cooperative relationship. We managed to significantly increase the funding for it. The hard part is we did it with a 4-year sunset. That sunset's approaching here in June. And so we're trying to protect those gains against a legislature that's looking at a $1 billion structural deficit. They have never to date rated our 911 fund. We think we're going to keep it clean, but one never knows. So.
Thank you. If each of you could ask the federal government and the state government for one thing to kind of improve the process or improve anything regarding disaster response and recovery, what would that be? And I
can jump in. So one part of my my history that didn't make it into the bio you got is my very first job out of college was working for a 10-county JPA in eastern South Dakota, writing flood mitigation grants to FEMA. So I was a grant writer trying to help my small communities, counties, and cities access FEMA dollars after some significant funding. The response, we were at the tail end of the response, but we're working toward mitigation. So with that, now that's the beginning of my career was a while ago, but we continue to, I think, like others, struggle with application and access requirements to funding with FEMA. But actually the bigger issue that we've had in a couple of our counties are areas that were declared disaster areas where there was a response, but in one county, I think we're like 10 years out post-response, and they still have not received their full funding reimbursement from FEMA. And so we've seen in a handful of our counties an issue where a decade later, so if you think of that, for those of you who are elected officials in the room, that county board has changed in 10 years. There's maybe a lot of staff that are the same, but you have staff turnover, you have all new board members, and they're still sort of pursuing the same reimbursement that they feel they were promised by the federal government. And now there's sort of a dispute about which things are eligible. And so 10 years out is a really hard time when you're working with a government partner to try to recreate what was going on at that time to make the case that the federal government still owes that money. And that's happened for us in a couple of counties. These are all flooding counties where the response is long, the mitigation is long, and yeah, so that's what I would answer is I know that the upfront paperwork is hard, but that decade-long reimbursement process just is not reasonable for local governments.
How about the state?
I actually think we have a very productive relationship with our state right now. The disaster relief account was a huge step forward for us. So I'm still maybe riding on the high of a bill we passed a couple of years ago that really significantly improved our partnership with the state for assisting with recovery.
So maybe I'll mention two things. One is a very more technical element associated with what's happening immediately with wood fiber product after a forest fire. Standing dead timber is probably marketable for about one season. And one of the things I think we find is so many of the resource folks are actually deployed to fight fires that what we find right after that fire is there's not the expertise to be able to say how do we get a forest sale in place so we can get wood fiber off the forest. We're struggling with the resources necessary to do sediment control because right after a fire, oftentimes we're now seeing fires that are actually going out at the end of the season when the first snow or the first rains start to come. And so that soil is barren, sedimentation, soil stabilization, and a lot of those types of things oftentimes take environmental assessments or even EISs to occur. And so there's no resources being deployed in that post-fire environment to deal with the environmental issues. And so we're doing a little bit better at our state level with some of that, in particular embedding a forester in the fire team to be able to work on the post-fire treatments that need to occur on the ground. We're not quite there yet with the Forest Service, and so I think that's one of the areas that I think we're concerned about. The other thing I think at the federal level we would like to see is oftentimes for a federal declaration and for some federal assistance to occur, you have to have the density. The density has to be within this geographic area. And sometimes like in our Northeast fire that occurred across the 4-county area, geographically very large, and the damage was spread out over a very large geographic area. So we didn't meet the density in the rural area, and yet if that would have that same impact would have occurred in a small geographic area, it would have in fact been enough to trigger the requirement. So we've been proposing some potential changes either to FEMA rules or legislation.
Great, thanks.
I don't know that our issues are quite as big. I have a couple of my commissioners in the room, so we can get to the open discussion part. I'm probably going to hear it differently, but in general, I think our capacity to get a declaration and get the federal money moving post-disaster has been about as good as it can be. The bigger issue for us, though, is prevention and mitigation, and the availability of resources to do that, the complexity of doing it, and then simply the vast amount of potential areas in our state that would need that resource. Again, getting back to the notion that, for a couple hundred years we've been building streamside and riverside in all of our municipalities, and that's probably our single biggest issue in that respect.
Great. I do want to be sensitive to our time because I want to get through all the issues, but I would like to take maybe 2 questions from the audience if anyone has any questions for our panelists. Come on, there's got to be one. Here we go. Oh, there you go. Yes.
Just a comment. I appreciate your comment about FEMA's really early reimbursement policies. I represent Sonoma County. We're now experiencing our most recent flooding with $200 million of damage to roads and private and public property, and $100 million of unreimbursed county's expenses from our firestorms in October, including a denial of our claim for $22 million in road repairs from FEMA, from the debris trucks. We lost 5,300 homes. They said, we didn't have a road system to begin with, therefore we're not going to pay to upgrade it. Well, let me tell you about the enormous ruts in our roads from heavily laden debris trucks. I know that you all are experiencing the same thing. Lake County has still had not reimbursement from FEMA. I don't know what NACo could do about this, but we are all collectively struggling and will be struggling in the future. And I think with the disasters coming frequently in all of our states, that it is really time to have some concerted effort about legislation and different policies for FEMA. Their reimbursements, we all need to know going into this what they will reimburse for and get a timeline on reimbursements.
Thank you for your comment. We have one more back there.
This one, I'm Gary Yeager from South Dakota, and I'm just wondering, how antiquated are you finding in your state legislatures their laws on both man-made disasters or natural disasters? Because when we had to do some research on our own state laws, they go back to the Cold War era, 1950s.
Yeah. Well, and as I said, I started my career in South Dakota doing flood response in the eastern side of the state, so I can appreciate that comment. I guess that's not been a top concern for us in Minnesota, our emergency manager association in Minnesota is very active, and in general, emergency management is a pretty universally liked issue in a bipartisan way for us. So even though we have a divided legislature, and that's kind of our history in Minnesota, we typically have divided government. Our Emergency Managers Association has done a good job of working with our legislature to stay on top of that. So that's not one of the concerns that rises up for us.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next subject, and obviously at the end we can come back if other people have questions regarding disaster. The next topic we're going to discuss is marijuana. I'm going to apologize in advance for my opening on this. I borrowed this off our webpage, but I thought it was kind of entertaining, so I'm going to share it. Marijuana has lit up conversations and controversy across the country. That didn't get any kind of little laugh there.
No one wants to admit that they understood.
Yeah, okay, maybe that's it, okay. It is hotly contested and complicated issues for states to weed through, and no doubt will remain high on legislative agendas for the unforeseeable, for the foreseeable future. Currently, over 30 states, the District of Columbia, Guam, and Puerto Rico have approved a comprehensive medical marijuana cannabis program. Over 20 states have decriminalized small amounts of marijuana. And a growing number of states, 10, and the District of Columbia have legalized small amounts of marijuana for adult recreational use. And for this purposes, I'm just going to call this adult use. With Washington State being one of the first states back in, I believe, 1998, maybe, to allow for medical use, and then in 2012 for adult use. I'm going to turn to Eric first to kind of tell us a little about lessons learned and how counties are handling this or preparing for this and what challenges you may have faced.
Great. Well, thank you. How many states do have some form of recreational or medical going on? So... yeah, I can guarantee you it's going on in every state. There's no question about that. So let me, this is actually, we had a great cannabis roundtable earlier this week, and I think maybe a number of you had. And I'm not here to endorse or tell you should do this, but it's more about if your state has not moved into the recreational arena yet, here are some things to be thinking about, and particularly. I will add one more, little snarky element to the state, is that we jokingly say that the state has bogarted all of the money as well. So for those of you that don't know what that means, you can Google it. Ours was adopted by Citizens Initiative, and those of your states that have a Citizens Initiative authority, I think that's probably where many of yours will come from, because the citizens are much further along in accepting this concept of recreational marijuana used for adult use than perhaps the legislature themselves are. And that is what happened in our state. And the mistake that we made as a county body was not talking to the framers of that citizens initiative. And the revenue distribution is clear that our state is going to project next biennium $750 million in excise tax to the state budget. State budget will be about $50 million. So almost $1 billion will come from excise tax on recreational marijuana. Counties may share about $30 million of that 750 million. And that was really one of the biggest mistakes that we made. And we really would tell you that whether it's a citizens initiative process or you're talking to your legislature, talk about a mechanism to get access to either the state collection of excise tax and redistribution to local government, or, as in California, an actual authority for local revenue to provide either an excise tax or a sales tax upon it. I would just tell you that that was probably the biggest failure that we made, was not having a discussion with the framers of the citizens initiative process. Land use is clearly an issue, and I would really encourage you to be thinking about this from what's oftentimes referred to as seed to sale, or I would even talk about seed to disposal, because there's still a disposal issue of a lot of things that are going on as well. So production, processing, and retail and disposal, but thinking about it, the entire life cycle. When I'm referring to this, you need to be putting that in your complete context. And sometimes people only think about it from where you buy it at, but it's oftentimes the most contentious issue is probably not at retail. It is at probably production. It's where it's being grown, either indoor or outdoor, from a variety of perspectives. And we have a Chelan County Commissioner, and I think San Juan County and Clark. I know that we have a number of counties here in Washington State that have been dealing with this. Not preempting your local control. If you want to retain local control and not permit any of those elements from happening, make sure that there is a authority granted to you to either ban or limit or prohibit or set aside where that can occur. Make sure your zoning authorities are protected. I really encourage you to be thinking about that. So that's on the land use side. We can talk a lot more about code enforcement and other things, but I want to keep it at kind of fairly high level. The revenue side, which I've talked about, for us in Washington State, the banking issue is not as significant as other areas. We have a couple of state chartered banks that have allowed, but if the marijuana industry cannot do banking with federally insured banks. It's one of the oddities of this whole industry is they can't touch federally issues, and we can talk more about what those look like. They can't have federal water. There's really a discussion about whether or not they can be transported on federal waters. So we have a grow operation in San Juan County. Can it be transported across the waters or even flown off the island because of FAA and Coast Guard rules? It's really strange, a lot of those types of things. I've heard that a newspaper that was being submitted through the post office was told they could no longer do that because they had an advertisement for a marijuana industry within it. I mean, there's just all sorts of strange regulations because they touched with the federal government. So, but banking is a major issue because counties in California, for example, now there's just a lot of cash coming into the county treasurers. I mean cash, a lot of cash coming in. And so it's not like a banking industry that there can just be transmitted. So if your state is going to, and county's going to have authority, figuring out how to have cash handling in a way that you've never had it before. I've heard from folks in Northern California where it is pretty amazing how much is going on with that. Enforcement, law enforcement, one of the backlogs that we're seeing right now is unlike a breathalyzer test for a DUI for someone who's consumed alcohol. There's some field sobriety tests, but otherwise it's a blood draw, and that blood draw's got to go to a lab. So for that DUI, huge backup in under the influence for marijuana, and so our labs have been unable to catch up with those issues on that side. I mean, I could talk for a long time around marijuana, but I'll stop there. I think a lot of you already know some of these pieces, and we can come back for more questions.
Yep. Anyone else?
Let me just pitch in a little bit. Pennsylvania is a medical marijuana state, and that passed on what I would call moral grounds. We had a few true believers, family impacted, and so on in the General Assembly that pushed it through. As we saw it beginning to coalesce, Eric helped us, and a couple of the other states helped us put together in our own policy committees issues that we needed to deal with as we developed the legislation and things, and how it was going to impact our local services. So we're talking criminal justice, behavioral health, ag issues, zoning, and all the rest of it. And so that was very helpful. But Pennsylvania, it seemed that was as far as it was going to go. However, Pennsylvania has a rich history in compromising its morals. And so back in the 70s, we did lottery because everybody was doing lottery and benefit senior citizens, and they pretty well walled that off, and that's cool. But we were never going to do gaming. And then we had a budget crisis in 2003, and slots. Okay, we'll do slots. But that is it. 3 years later, another budget crisis. Table games. Table games is good. Yep, fine. And you remember I mentioned $1 billion structural deficit last year. We went full on sports, internet, gaming, and all the rest of it. So fast forward just 1 year later, literally as we speak, our governor sent our lieutenant governor on a listening tour of all 67 counties should we, in Pennsylvania, legalize recreational marijuana. I still handicap it about 60-40 against in our General Assembly. I handicap it the other way in terms of popular support, and they're probably getting an even better ratio during the listening tour. But I think it's something that we're going to be dealing with again. Our association is putting together, again, a policy team to really deal with all of the response issues that we're going to have to see as a part of that legislature. My staff is sitting over at that table taking copious notes of everything Eric said so far.
So let me add just a couple things from Minnesota. We do have a medical marijuana law. It's one of the strictest/tightest in the nation. It's very narrowly applied. But we do, like other states, we've been talking about adult use legalization. And this year in our legislature, we do have 3 bills that look at some version of adult use in different ways. My attempt at adding humor to this, and again, some people find this funny, some people in our state find it deeply offensive, but the House file that is progressing in Minnesota is House File 420. And our bill numbers are generally assigned by lottery, but somebody got, a little cute with that bill number, and that's the one that's getting the most attention. So what we did, and the advice I would have, I think this comes from where Eric was speaking as well. As an association, so I work for our statewide association of counties in Minnesota, and as an association, I fully suspect we will never take a position on whether or not adult use should be legal or not. But we recently formed a work group of our members, a big table work group of commissioners and various department head types for the various departments Eric just mentioned, everything from law enforcement, public health, planning and zoning, corrections, etc., with a charge to essentially learn from the other states. We have, those of us who have not done this yet, have the opportunity to learn from what's happened in other states. And so our staff, for those of you who might be in the same place we are, where you sort of feel like it's on the horizon for you and you need to start understanding what the impact might be, the purpose of our work group is to understand all these things that Eric just talked about. I have a staffer who's creating a huge matrix of every state and all the components of their laws to try to understand from our colleagues around the country what they think went well, what isn't working well, and how we might want to give feedback to our legislature about the pieces that would impact our business or our working counties. In Minnesota, my crystal ball says it's not going to pass this year. I think it probably will eventually pass. For a couple of reasons. A big one is revenue. This is a new emerging source of revenue, and all levels of government are looking for new sources of revenue. But secondly, the argument around decriminalization and equity and those issues are prevalent also in this debate in Minnesota. And so there's a lot of diverse interests at the table that are starting to talk about why we should move this forward. There is the fourth bill in Minnesota that's been introduced is essentially creating a statewide task force. Now, if I was going to bet which one of these bills might pass this year, a task force bill seems like the right bet to make. I think everybody wants to understand better the interactions between revenue and cost for government. So Minnesota is a state like Washington, I think. Do you do human services at the local level? Some.
Yep.
So we do, our counties do chemical dependency, social services programming. So there's a lot of things to consider about revenue versus cost in this arena. And you can see we're all kind of engaged in talking about this one because this is a leading edge issue. But the other issue that we're spending a little time on, the only one I didn't hear you mention, Eric, was counties as employers and our workplace policies related to drug testing and what that looks like in this new world. All of these are things that a dozen other states have already tackled and we have a chance to learn from. So that's what our work group is going to be focused on. Certainly for this year and until and when this kind of really gets the momentum to pass in Minnesota. We are not an initiative state, so we don't have citizen-driven initiatives. Our legislature can choose to put items on the ballot and does. This seems like one of those things they might. They sometimes do with these kind of issues, decide to let the people speak, but I'm not sure that it would happen that way. The good thing about that is in those cases, the legislature writes the ballot issue, and when it's not citizen driven, you have a lot more opportunity to influence what that looks like. So
there's one other item that I neglected to mention, and that is the harmonization for those states that have medical now. Our medical system was not regulated. It was the wild, wild west in our medical system. And so the legislature had to come back and determine how to harmonize a regulated recreational system with an unregulated medical system. And there was no tax on the unregulated medical system. It was estimated that about 85 to 90% of those that were utilizing the medical system were self-medicating for recreational reasons. And so which would you rather go to? Stay with your medical system where you didn't pay a 33.5% excise tax on product, or going to the recreational system where you did have that tax and access and collaboratives and whole other things that they had to. So as you're thinking about moving from the medical or adding into the recreational, you've got to really think significantly about how do you harmonize those two systems once they're in place. And that was not thought out through our initiative process, but hopefully through the legislative process, they will be thinking more structurally about how they harmonize those two systems.
Thank you. I mean, you've talked about the public safety, taxation, banking, workforce. What about the public education side of it? And maybe, Eric, that goes more towards you because you've obviously Washington State's kind of been in the lead on this.
Education in terms of
just awareness about the issue and what it is and what it isn't.
Yeah, there's a lot to that question because one of the things I'll give you one element of public education. Edibles are a big part of the recreational system. And you're talking about public education is packaging of edibles. So as those are sitting on the counter somewhere, they look like any other potential product that you might want to mint or something, or a chocolate or something, is how do we have public education around packaging of edibles so that they are not consumed inappropriately by minors. Just in the household or kids visiting, etc. So, but in general, there is a public education campaign similar to Don't Drink and Drive. What is it? What's your limit in terms of use of marijuana? But I don't know if we've had too much real significant education and outreach around overconsumption or of use. Maybe one of the other county commissioners might know more about it. We do, similar to alcohol, they do sting operations for underage purchase at the point of retail sales to make sure that they're abiding by. It's very strict. You actually have to usually show 21-year-old. You actually show your ID generally to even enter a marijuana store in most cases. So.
That is one of the blessings of the governor's listening tour that we're doing now, because these are typically long day meetings, and you do get people out on both sides, regular citizenry, but obviously people who have an interest on one side or the other. And it is taking it to different localities, urban and rural and everything in between, and so gets a huge amount of local media attention. And so where, the threshold is, should we allow it, shouldn't we allow it, is one thing, and people, make a little visceral decision on that basis. But once you get to hear the complexity of all the issues that are involved, and it does generate a good bit better public discussion than we otherwise might have had.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything? No, keep going. So why don't we take a couple minutes just to open it up to questions? Here, if you could just say where you're from and introduce yourself.
I'm from Iowa. it's really split. Number one is for you at Washington State, and this deals with your state association now. How did you register for that as a state association when it was in the legislature?
Again, it was a citizens initiative, and so it was a citizens initiative of citizens. I don't know how we would have, to be honest. We probably would have been talking about, if this passes, these are the things that we need within a bill that passes like this. I suspect is how we would have.
And now for the other two of you who don't have recreational, have you given any thought to how you would be registering for your association?
Yeah, same thing. Well, first, medical was a legislative enactment. Pennsylvania does not have initiative. And we did not take a position on it per se, but same thing. Here are all the contingency issues. Here are things that need to be addressed. And as I said, we're reinvigorating that study group. And so I do not expect that our membership would take a position one way or another on recreational use, but learning from these experiences, okay, you got to deal with this, you got to deal with that. And these are the metes and bounds that we're going to need to see from our perspective.
Yeah, I think I could practically say ditto from Minnesota. We may ultimately decide as we work through all of these issues, we'll get sort of a white paper done for our association, all the considerations, and it may be at the end of that it's clear to us that we want to take a position one way or another. My gut tells me that won't be the case, that we will more than likely say these are all the things that local governments are concerned about, and if you have a bill, we want these things addressed, but ultimately not take a position on the base bill. But I could be wrong.
I mean, this would be a very interesting question for our members to have, because in the end, we wanted the assurance that every individual county would be able to say, yes, we'll allow this in our county or not. And so at the root of it, it was about local control. At the root of it. Now, I think we all know that transportation of marijuana is going to move back and forth. I mean, I know counties which say, they have a county that has banned it, and right across the county line in the unincorporated area, probably unlike alcohol, is a pot shop.
Or a fireworks stand. That's the line between Minnesota and Wisconsin.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see how our members ultimately dealt with this as a local control issue as well.
Yeah.
So I'm Commissioner Jenkins from Utah. We're a medical marijuana state by about 5 weeks.
Oh.
And my question, we're surrounded by recreation states.
You are.
And so the question I have is, how's transportation handling this? How's the American Trucking Association and people like that? What are they doing? Because the markers from marijuana stay in your system for up to a month. And so how are they handling DUIs and all this kind of stuff?
So in Washington State, your workplace and drug laws do not change. Nothing in the state law that permitted the legal use of marijuana says that you can come stoned just like you can't come drunk. It does change and that becomes the harder part about then taking the blood test. Was it at a level that you were impaired by? Which gets back to that whole lab issue, same issue we're having elsewhere. It is a potential issue. But nothing in statute changes that. And so impairment, if you're impaired as an impaired worker, like you said, it might remain in your system, but you're going to go and have a blood test just like you would after any normal incident or accident. And if you are shown to be high, you're probably subject to termination.
And I do think that's part of the discussion we were even having for counties as employers, if they have drug testing for certain job classes as counties. Right now, people travel, even though we aren't geographically attached to states with legal adult use, people go on vacation and try things that are legal in that state when they're on vacation and then come home. And because of the science related to the lab testing, I think that's a question actually for all of us right now. An unanswered question.
Of course. Any more questions? Oh, one more here.
I just want to say, Layton County, Idaho, Commissioner. Thanks. Layton County, Idaho. A mile away from our primary city is Washington State, and it's legal. And just a few hundred feet across the border is where the first shop is. So And while people are certainly purchasing it and bringing it back into Idaho, our law enforcement in both the state, or I'm sorry, both the city police and the county sheriff's office don't report any crazy additional, very difficult times. And in fact, it's probably now legally acquired marijuana, not legally then transported back into Idaho marijuana, but it's at least legally acquired and not just purchased on the street, in our state. So it still exists. It existed before. It exists now. I think they've sort of, even though it's very illegal in Idaho, they don't take it to the point of trying to lock people up. I think they give citations, they take it away, they say, don't do it again. I mean, I think they're being fairly reasonable with their reaction on our side, which I think is helpful, and it's not creating a jail issue or other issues in Idaho.
Great. Thank you. I'm sure there may be additional questions, but I'm hoping our panelists will stay after a few minutes after if people want to continue the line of questioning. We're going to move on to elections now. Counties and states share many duties when it comes to administering an election. Except for the $380 million in spending last year for election security, federal funding has been scarce, even as voting technology bought in the early 2000s ages. One of my first jobs at NCSL was covering unfunded mandates. And I remember how we viewed HAVA as a large unfunded mandate. Is funding a top issue for your counties, and how did your counties work with your state when the $380 million was distributed? And we'll give you a break. Why don't we start at the other end of the table this time?
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you so much. So, Pennsylvania is one of the poster children for non-voter verifiable paper audit trail. Back in 2006 under HAVA, when we did all the replacements, voter verified was not certified in PA, and I can talk to you another time about why. But the bottom line is we don't have any now. We have 17 counties that use optical scan, but still doesn't quite qualify under current standards. So last year in April, our governor issued a press release, not an order, but a press release that they were requiring all the counties in Pennsylvania to replace their equipment with voter verifiable paper audit trail by April of 2020, presidential primary. And then we set about saying, how could we possibly accomplish that? Could we move the calendar a bit? We started talking about funding and all the rest. And what we came to find out in the fall, when it was finally announced, is sub rosa, they were negotiating with the Jill Stein presidential campaign on a settlement agreement based on litigation that she brought out of a recount in 2016. And so we actually have a court order now that we have to replace all of our equipment by 2020, April 2020. So we're working with our General Assembly to get funding for it. The governor, our estimated cost, depending on what equipment we buy, is somewhere between $90 and $150 million statewide. Our governor has committed to proposing at least 50% state funding. He did that in his budget address, but in a unique way. $15 million this year, $15 million a year for the next 4. By the way, he won't be governor in the last of those years. So, okay, fine. We're working with the legislature to A, increase the amount, and B, front load it, because now is when we're actually making those expenditures. And the hard part too was that as we got through toward the end of 2018, we only had 1 piece of equipment certified for use. We're now up to 4, and counties are making that very quick decision now on what they're going to deploy, how they're going to get it, and how they're going to get it in place. So tomorrow we'll be meeting with our senators, and a number of our members are going to be meeting with House delegation. One of the things we're talking about is how do we get some additional federal money into the pot. In our case, we got about 13, not quite $14 million out of the federal HAVA money. State put in its 5% match, so about $14.1 million against the $150, you remember. And that was distributed just based on the formula we used with the HAVA money to begin with. So that wasn't really an issue. It was the sufficiency of the funding against the problem and the timeline that we're working through.
So Washington State is, I think, along with Oregon, maybe there's others, we're a complete vote-by-mail state. And so
interesting.
So we it's very interesting to start to look at where our risk assessment is. Our risk assessment has really shown our largest one has been a kind of a combination of a centralized, decentralized voter data registration system. And so most of our resources that came actually is working with our county auditors and the Secretary of State on a new voter registration database system that is going to be centralized. And that is going to be a major change for our county auditors. And so that's probably the biggest area where not only our security risk actually lies, but also how the monies were utilized and how we worked in partnership to talk about what the individual counties had to do from a security perspective, because they are oftentimes the point of entry into that centralized database system. And so making sure of, two-function authentication, what's the right word? Where else is our penetration risks at? Our tabulation systems are not internet-based. They are completely in rooms that have no internet access to them, either hardwired or cellular or any way. So our tabulation systems are not connected to the internet in any way, shape, or form. So, we get the paper ballot. The paper ballot is then tabulated in a system that has no internet connection or any wireless connection or anything else. And so, our greater risk is actually in voter registration and what might happen with a voter registration list. And you can, just kind of think out loud what you might want to do with a voter registration list if you had access to that and could identify the voting trends of certain types of individuals and hack that type of who would actually get a ballot. Can you modify their ballot? Can you send them something separately? Can you make sure they don't get a ballot? So our system our concern is more about the distribution of that ballot and who actually is in the registration system than the actual tabulation.
So I think this issue is so interesting in a number of ways. And in Minnesota, there's a couple things happening that I want to share with you that are they may be unique to us, or they may be things that you should be paying attention to that may be on their way to you. But I just find this whole conversation so interesting because of the rapid change from how do we make this system more based in technology, more efficient, quicker, to now we're kind of unwinding systems like Doug mentioned that are concerns about electronic data tabulation, electronic voting, et cetera. And so I guess for better in this case, Minnesota is still a paper ballot-based state, which gives us a great deal of security and tracking and gives our voters a great deal of confidence in that system. That said, we have a number of things that have either recently happened or happening in Minnesota that may be of interest. We are concerned with technology and cybersecurity, of course, in some aspects of our process. But actually, data privacy is a really interesting emerging issue that I think is occurring across the country. So, one of the ways this has played out in Minnesota is we have always been a caucus state, meaning our presidential preference decisions were done by the parties in a caucus-based system. Those were not elections run by the county or the state government. And so when you register to vote in Minnesota, you do not have to declare a party. And we're private Midwestern stock people. We like to go and vote and not necessarily have everybody and all of our neighbors know what we're thinking and what our party preference is. And so last year, our legislature did vote to move to a presidential primary state, meaning for the first time, we're going to have a brand new election run by our counties. It's just an additional election that we now have to fund and run, really on behalf, from our perspective, on behalf of the political parties. And we're concerned about the funding for that. There has been some state funding allocated. Like most things, I don't think it's controversial to say it's probably not going to be enough money to cover the costs of running another election. But the part that has gotten interestingly controversial about that is you will have to pick a ballot at your polling place, and there is the potential that your neighbors will know which of the ballots you're choosing. So there's a polling place culture issue, but also there's concern that data then and those voter rolls will not be well enough protected private data. And so, there will be an ability for folks to request that data and find out people's political party. This is very controversial in our state at the moment. And one of the ways our association along with our Secretary of State, is working to address this, is trying to move a bill through our legislature this year that would make our presidential primary process a full mail ballot process, which would remove some of these issues as well as the cost for us, frankly. But that's not our culture. That's not our background. People like going to a polling place. We allow for some mail balloting in rural areas, but it's not our tradition. So there's a lot of concern around this presidential primary. It's a new election to administer and the issues around it. One common issue I think that's true across many states, when it comes to funding is an issue, but I would say one of our biggest concerns and issues as counties is the ability to recruit election judges, election day, like volunteer workers, with minimal or no compensation, and train them then to deal with these more and more complex security issues. So election judges, funding for that, training for that, all of that. Right now, that's a huge issue for our counties. And then the quirky thing about Minnesota is that we are now the only remaining state in the country that has not actually accessed that federal money. Our legislature has to approve the allocation of those federal dollars to our Secretary of State, and that has gotten caught up in some partisan politics in our state, unfortunately. And that was supposed to be one of the first items tackled by our legislature this year. And now there's, like all easy to pass bills, a lot of folks are wanting to attach some things to that bill that are not as easy to pass. And so right now that money, which in Minnesota, it's a significant amount of money for us. I think it's, Matt, is it $6 million for the state that we would receive? My expert's in the room with me here. So it would be $6 million to the state, and through our process, $1 million of that would come out to counties. And both our state Secretary of State and our counties have been sitting on our hands for over a year with that money from the federal government sitting on the table, and we haven't been able to access it. So that's probably our number one concerning complaint, but we're the only state in the country, so that one is hopefully not a trend coming to you anytime soon.
Thank you for that. Given we've got about 10 to 12 minutes left, I'm going to skip my question. Does anyone in the room have a question or two regarding for elections? Because we're going to at least leave a few minutes to talk about taxes.
This is just a comment. I'm Ricky Hatch. I'm a county clerk auditor in Utah. Just a bit of information as far as cost for new equipment for those of you who might be doing that in the future. The pricing model for elections equipment has changed dramatically from 10 years ago. It used to be that you would pay 80 to 90% of the cost of the equipment up front, and then you'd pay a maintenance fee over time, which equated to about 10 to 15%. That dynamic is now 50-50 pretty much. We noticed in Utah, we did this last year. For example, so when you go and ask for funding from the state, be sure to encourage ongoing funding to cover the maintenance for it, because it'll eat you up. It's pretty pricey. And then finally, if you go through a vote by mail route, that also will level out your spikes, your spending spikes as far as equipment goes, because in Utah, we spent $26 million on our equipment back in 2005. In 2018, we spent $9 million because there's a lot less equipment needed for polling places. You can centralize it. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We're going to move on to our last topic, which is taxes, and in particular the state and local tax deduction. The SALT deduction was capped at $10,000 in the 2017 tax law. States have looked to ease the impact of the federal provision on their constituents and have considered a few different strategies. First, if you're aware, can you tell me, has your state attempted such efforts? And because we are running short on time, I'm going to throw in my second, make it a two-part question. Besides the SALT deduction, are there other big tax issues counties and your state are facing?
Pennsylvania has not done anything about SALT. I think it's still a little too new for them to have a sense of what the impact is. Overall viewpoint is that it's a bigger issue in some of our southeastern areas closer to Philadelphia where the real estate market is higher, and then in some of our other suburban areas with higher real estate values, and that's because Pennsylvania is heavily dependent on the property tax for schools in particular, and then for counties, that is the only local tax base that we have. So once we start to hear the kicks and screams and cries, the legislature might take a look at it, but candidly, I don't know what they would do as an alternative. And so, but we do have that residual. We've always had that issue. Our General Assembly wants to get rid of the property tax altogether, although in their view, the only one they want to get rid of is the school property tax. The system they would put in place actually would move more of the local tax base onto the individual because of how business is taxed at the local level. And so for all of those reasons, it hasn't moved, but it remains a top topic of discussion.
Thank you.
Really has not been an issue or changed, I would say, the taxing philosophy of our legislature or any of the proposals. We still see proposals for local sales tax options. We're still seeing property tax discussion. So I don't think we're seeing any cause and effect between the change in federal income tax laws in relationship to the tax policy of the state of Washington. If anything, sales tax continues to be very regressive in the minds of folks. So they don't like sales tax. Our quote, progressive Democrats don't like sales tax. But it's not because of SALT. I don't think anything like that. I think new tax discussion. If you don't know, we have a governor that wants to run for president, and climate change is his baby. He's proposed a carbon tax. We've had carbon tax citizens initiatives. They are not moving and have had a real hard time moving through our legislature. I don't know whether one will come about this year or not, but that certainly has been bantered about. We continually see a lot of property tax exemptions, and that is. Every time I say there can't be another one found, there was one for retiring farmers, and property tax exemption for retiring farmers coming out. So every time I say there can't be another one, there is yet another one being identified, which is either a tax shift to those that are full paying, or it's a revenue loss to counties. And the reason property tax is so much more important, and we have a 1% property tax cap in Washington State passed by Citizens Initiative. The legislature is pretty ambivalent to it, largely because of their revenue. Only about 12% is property tax. Cities, it's about 20%. For counties, it's 60%. The 1% property tax has a unbelievable harder impact on county government, but because it's such a small part of the state revenue source, who's largely sales tax, business and occupation tax, they don't worry about that property tax cap. And maybe a new gas tax, maybe as well.
So specific to SALT, maybe there's been a little more conversation about this in Minnesota than other states, because we are classified as one of those high tax states like New York, California, and so because our top tier income tax is quite high. This was a big issue of discussion actually at our legislature, and the impact of the federal changes on the taxes Minnesotans pay. Now, completely separately and having no real connection to this, our legislature was unable to pass a tax conformity bill last session. So normally we have a cleanup bill where we bring our tax laws into conformity with the federal tax law. That got caught up in end of session issues last session, didn't get passed. So then the plan was that would be one of the first bills, along with that election funding, that they were just going to get off the table in January. Hasn't quite happened because tax conformity is something everyone agrees on, but if you've got a tax bill, there's an awful lot of other things people would like to discuss in that. So for us, a couple of factors related to SALT specifically. One is we are, maybe unlike New York, some of the other high tax states that we're classified with, we actually get a smaller proportion of our revenue from that high end income tax, and we have more diversification. So the ultimate impact on our state budget is probably lower, but it's a big issue of interest and concern to our taxpayers in Minnesota. That coupled with the fact, you may be aware that in Minnesota it's a little bit cold for about half the year, and we have a significant snowbird phenomenon where a lot of our residents, retirees in particular, but a lot of our residents like to have another home somewhere in the country where it's warmer and the weather might not kill them, which I think we just looked, and the temperature in Minnesota today is like negative 26. So I've been walking around without a coat on here. It feels like spring here. But because of that coupling effect of our tax rates and then our climate, we do have a lot of conversation about income tax loss and how the SALT piece plays into it. So we are really hopeful about the work NACo's been doing related to this issue. It sounds like the president might be interested in taking another look at this, and we will be active in working with the other counties across the country that see this as a priority. A lot of the same issues that Eric said in terms of lots of tax exclusions. There's always a new idea for a carve out. But for us in Minnesota, the property tax is our primary source of revenue, far and away. So almost exclusively in some areas. And so the ability to fund our county governments comes from that tax. So exclusions make a huge issue for us in the reapportionment of tax burden to our communities. We're having a really serious talk about gas tax this session. Our governor has proposed, Matt, is it a 20 cent gas tax, which is a very high number for us, increase. But we have a lot of bottled demand for a good solid transportation bill. So I think we will see something in the area of gas tax this year, though it is, again, when you have a divided legislature, one house is Democratic, one house is Republican, it's going to be a hotly debated issue. Any tax policy will be.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one question. Do we have one final question from anyone in the audience? Here we go, sir.
I thought you might say something about Medicaid expansion. I thought you might say something about Medicaid expansion in this session, just because we had so many proclamations around the country this year. Mm-hmm. Idaho, I'm from Idaho, and we passed it by 61%. Yep. And the legislature has actually now funded it through the JFAC committee, the financial committee. But there are political elements within the very Republican legislature that thinks this is horrible, and they're trying to repeal it, and they're trying to add on all sorts of crippling features to make Medicaid expansion not work in Idaho. I just wanted to hear about the whole issue of, the citizens say yes, the legislature's trying to say no to something. That just seems crazy to me that they would do something against the voters of the state. This being a state legislature conversation, what?
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know. We haven't had that controversy. We signed Medicaid expansion into law on day one, 9 years ago, and it was a benefit to our state budget because it helped to provide more federal funding for things that in Minnesota we were already doing. So we have a lot of experience with it. That doesn't mean it wasn't controversial at the time in our legislature to do it, but what they actually did was they passed it saying that they would give it was at election time, they'd give the next governor the opportunity to decide. And so Governor Mark Dayton was elected 8 years ago, and his first act as governor was to sign expansion. So it's played out in different ways for us, but and it continues to be controversial about the impact on our healthcare marketplace. But overall, the expansion has been, there may be public debate about it among legislators, but nobody's made a concerted effort to try and roll it back because it would devastate our budget.
Same in PA.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists.